Go ahead and get going here. So this is my last lesson for all of you. I have greatly enjoyed teaching this class. I had been talking to Matt O'Brien earlier in January and telling him we're almost to Jesus. Like, we've been teaching this program for so long, and we're almost to Jesus, and we're at Esther. Jesus is weeks away, and we're leaving. Jesus good. I have greatly enjoyed teaching this class. It has been my pleasure. It is a requirement of mine that I teach at a church. In my mind, if I'm going to go to a church, there needs to be a place for me to teach. So when Duke called me when we were in California, not yet having moved out here, he invited us to come to the church, and I says, "Is there a class for me to teach?" That was exactly how that conversation went. He says, "I think we can arrange that." He says that I would love to come. That's what we'll need to do over the summer. Go from pastor to pastor and ask, "Is there a class to teach?" Who knows? Maybe they're doing the Gospel Project too. But again, it's been my pleasure to teach. When I was looking at when my last week was going to be, and I looked at the schedule, I says, how appropriate that Esther is my last lesson. I have not been controversial for a while in this class. Not since I argued that Goliath was not 9.5 feet tall. That fell flat in this group. As flat as a pancake, and I haven't gone that way. Controversial. Not for out of choice. There just hasn't been. I'm not going to be controversial for the sake of being controversial. Usually. I do that with my students sometimes, just to keep them on their toes, but for the most part. I have a different view of Esther probably than everyone in this room. So when I was looking at it, I said, wow, that's how I'll end. So, you either like it or you say we never want to see you again, and I'll say, all right, I'll leave then if you insist. So I know that people like filling in blanks though. So I'm actually going to throw all the blanks up on the board at the beginning because what I'm going to say doesn't match at all what's on the notes for the most part. I'm going to argue that the traditional view of Esther is mistaken. Still, a book without all of the notes filled in, blanks filled in, that's not allowed. Whether they're right or wrong, you got to have blanks filled in. I get that. As I'm just going to introduce Esther as I flip through these initial slides here. Who was Esther? Yes. Yeah, so there was a queen named Vashti who was basically asked at a banquet by her husband Ahasuerus, who was a Persian king. The Persian king, if you're familiar with the Battle of Thermopylae in Greece, that's this king. He's actually famous for other reasons than the book of Esther. But Vashti had come down and had refused to come down and display herself before her guests. She didn't, she believed in She believed in women's rights. I don't know, in a way that I feel like we all should agree with. That she was being asked to just be put on display, and she was upset about that, and so she refused to do so, and so she got divorced. Not divorced, actually, because you didn't divorce a queen specifically, you just sent the queen back to the harem with all of the other wives and just never invited her back in to your bedroom. So you didn't want to get rid of the queen because then the queen would become somebody else's husband who's now the husband of a previous queen, and he could become a rival. Does that make sense? So Vashti would have spent the rest of her life in isolation in a room filled with a bunch of wives. What's that? And eunuchs who would help take care of that area of the palace, but she wouldn't be able to get out. And so that's what would have happened with Vashti. And so Esther then is the story, and here's how Esther is traditionally taught. Esther is made queen so that she could save the Jewish people from annihilation, from evil Haman. And Haman is the villain of the story. I often picture him like Jafar from Aladdin. He's the vizier. It actually works. Aladdin is from Persia. This is the Persian king. It actually works to see him as Jafar, kind of. He wasn't a magician. But that's the traditional view of Esther. This beautiful, godly woman chosen to be queen so that she could save the Jewish people. I agree she was beautiful. I'm going to disagree with almost everything else that I just said. Mordecai and Esther I should pray. I should pray. Of course I should pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, we come before you. I thank you for my opportunity to teach this class, for giving me that honor, and for each of these people here who have wanted to come listen to me. But more than that, have wanted to dig into your word, to understand your word better. Well, I pray that you continue to be with them as myself and my family leave, that you would help them to continue to grow in their knowledge and understanding of you and of your word. I pray that you would give them wonderful opportunities to serve you and to use the knowledge that they get in these classes for your glory. In your most holy name, amen. Let me send out the... What's that? Oh, the essential... Ooh. I don't have that. It didn't have any bold-faced words on it, so I thought there were no... When it was typed out for me, so I thought there were no blanks. I'm sorry. Yeah. Sure. What are the three words for the essential doctrine? Free, fulfilled, fulfill, free, fulfill, understand. All right. Mordecai and Esther. What do we know from the book about Mordecai and Esther? Not from the Sunday school lessons, but from the book itself. Well, we know that Mordecai is the cousin of Esther, and older than Esther, and has been raising Esther because her parents are dead. We know that. We know that they live in the Persian capital of Susa. So Persia had conquered Babylon. King Cyrus had conquered Babylon and then had allowed the people of Israel to go back to Jerusalem. And we studied them over the last couple of weeks of this course. The rebuilding of the temple with Ezra and in Haggai and Zechariah. But not all of the Jews went back to Jerusalem. And at least two of the Jews that did not go back to Jerusalem are Mordecai and Esther. The book of Esther begins in 483 BC. That's 56 years after the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem in 539. So while Mordecai would have been too young, certainly, to have been like one of the people that decided not to go back to Jerusalem, like maybe he was born 56 years earlier, right? But he would have been a baby, right? There's no indication that Mordecai is this very, very old man. Esther's father is his uncle, right? So they're of a similar generation. He's just a little bit older. So I see Mordecai probably in his 20s, his 30s, something like that, raising Esther. So he would not have been of the generation that decided not to go back to Jerusalem. He wasn't alive yet. His parents would have been of the generation that decided not to go back to Jerusalem. But it is interesting that he and his family decided not to go back in Jerusalem, and when Mordecai is older, he doesn't go back to Jerusalem, where the temple has been rebuilt, where sacrifices are to be made. And Mordecai has decided not to go back. For whatever reason, we don't know. Instead, he's moved in the opposite direction. So you have Jerusalem here, you have Babylon here, you have Susa here. So the Jews were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. Either he or his family has since moved to Susa, the opposite direction from Jerusalem. So we know that. Esther is described as having a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And that's all we know. It's interesting, I'll read commentaries and they'll talk about how Esther was this godly woman who trusted in God. The Bible never says that about Esther, never says that about Mordecai. Nowhere in the book does it say anything about them even being religious. Nowhere does it say they're godly. In fact, some of you may know this, Esther is the only book in the Bible where the name of God is never mentioned. God is not mentioned, prayer never happens. The closest you get to something somewhat religious in the book is fasting. But the Jews were not the only people to fast. Lots of people fasted in lots of religions. We don't even know if Esther and Mordecai believed in Yahweh. After all, we do know that the majority of the Jews did not follow God. That's why they were sent into captivity, right? The majority of the Jews followed false gods. That's one of the reasons why they were sent into captivity. No, I'm not saying we know that Esther wasn't a follower of God. I'm just saying the book never says that she was. And if you think about other places in Scripture where somebody was a follower of God, the Bible typically points that out. That in contrast to everybody else, this person was godly. That happens with Daniel, right? Daniel is presented as an exception to the generalization of how most Jews were not following God, but Daniel was righteous. His friends were righteous. Yes. It does say that she's Jewish. That's complicated. Most Jews did not follow God. That's why they were sent into captivity. Yeah. That's weird, huh? But that's the truth. So at the very least, we should say we don't know if she followed God. And the fact that it never says that she did is at least a potential strike against her and against Mordecai. The fact that she never prays, the fact that she never appeals to God, is at least a potential strike against her being a godly woman. Now, it's possible that the author of Esther just decides not to mention this about her, but then that's what we would have to conclude. What we cannot say is that the Bible says that she was godly, because it never actually says that. It's assumed in many discussions of Esther out there. I even read a commentary that assumed it the entire time that she was this godly woman, and I kept waiting for him to give me a piece of evidence, and he never did. I think there's other evidence that Esther was not following the law of Moses. Mordecai either. And we begin with the marriage between Esther and King Ahasuerus of Persia. Here is what the book of Esther reads. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put into the custody of Hegai, who had charge of the woman. And the young woman pleased him, Esther, pleased him, and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And yet every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So, the way this is taught in the VeggieTales episode, I had to go back and watch it just to remind myself. It's like a Miss America competition. And they come out, and like Esther doesn't have anything prepared. Like she has no song, right? She's not twirling a baton or anything like that, right? And she still wins the beauty competition, and that's how the VeggieTale Esther becomes the wife of Ahasuerus. It's not how it happened. In fact, was she supposed to marry him at all? The Bible is clear, the law of Moses is clear, that a Jew is never to marry a Gentile, a non-Jew. I just have one passage here, but there's like 20 that I could have pointed to. You shall not intermarry with them, that is Gentiles, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. If we go back into our history, anybody remember the first king that brought idolatry into the land of Israel? Solomon. Why? He brought in, it's not just that he had lots of wives, it's that he had lots of foreign, Gentile, pagan wives who brought in idolatry into the land, and it never left. Well, that's not true. It didn't leave until the return from exile. Uh-huh. That's my next slide. Shh. or maybe 2 slides from now. Maybe 2 slides from now. No. You're right. You're right. Like, did she have a choice? So the first question is, was the marriage moral, biblical? The second is, did she have a choice in getting married? Right? What's that? There would be a ceremony. Yeah. Now, it may be that she didn't have a choice of whether she shows up to the ceremony. Now, we don't have to go all the way back to Deuteronomy. We can go to Ezra, the time which Ezra would have been alive at the time of Esther. Now, Ezra was in Jerusalem, Esther in Susa. So there's no reason to necessarily believe that Esther knew about Ezra. However, Ezra specifically states that one of the reasons for the exile was intermarriage with Gentiles. Because you are marrying foreigners, God sent you into exile. In fact, Ezra actually required those who returned from exile to Jerusalem who had foreign wives, he required them to divorce them. And we know the Bible isn't like cool about divorce, right? So, pretty serious. So we should agree that it is explicitly against the law of Moses for Esther to marry King Ahasuerus. Now, whether she had a choice or not, different question. Did she want to? Now, whether she had a choice, she may not have had a choice. But even back when women didn't have choices, it didn't mean they didn't have desires. Right? So you could have a woman who, I have to marry him. Yes, I'm glad I have to marry him. And so we could ask the question, did Esther want to marry King Ahasuerus? Did Mordecai want her to? Now, we don't really know how she was chosen to go into the king. We don't know how that process went. We do know that Mordecai is standing around the palace a lot. We know that Mordecai is going to get a job in the palace. Mordecai is going to be helped by Esther becoming queen. Whether that was part of his desires or not, his thought process or not, we simply don't know. But what we do know is that Mordecai tells Esther to hide her Jewish lineage. Now, if I said, you're going to go into a foreign land, Ashley, as a missionary, but I want you to hide that you're a Christian, you now question if I've really been a good Bible teacher to you. True? Are we supposed to hide our identity? Realize if you hide your identity, there's things you're not going to be able to do. Contrast that with Daniel, who so didn't hide his Jewish identity that it kept getting him into trouble that God kept getting him out of, right? But no, Esther is to hide her Jewish lineage. Why? Well, not because she would have been killed. It wasn't illegal to be Jewish. So why hide? Well, it's a good chance that Ahasuerus doesn't want to marry a Jewess. So in order to increase your chances, Esther, to marry this Gentile king, don't tell anybody you're Jewish. That doesn't sound like the type of godly advice a godly cousin would give to the girl he is raising. Concealing her Jewishness helped her to become the wife of a Gentile king. Notice, this would have required her to eat the food of the palace given to her, which would have included non-kosher food, which would have included food sacrificed to an idol. That's why Daniel and his friends asked to have a different diet, because of their Jewishness. She wouldn't have been able to do that because she's hiding her Jewishness. So she would have had to eat food sacrificed to an idol. She would have had to eat non-kosher food. She would have had to worship the gods of the Persians. Right. It's very plausible, we don't know for certain, that she's a secular Jew. Or at the very least is not a Yahweh worshiping Jew. Maybe she worships Persian gods. I mean, we know lots of Jews worshiped other gods. Now, is this Esther's fault or is this Mordecai's fault? Does Esther even know the law of Moses? Has Mordecai taught her the law of Moses? Maybe she's ignorant about all of this. Look, what girl doesn't want to become queen? Doesn't want to be a princess? It's in all the movies. Right? Secondly, I'm so glad Rebecca just left. So I was going to have Rebecca go to Sunday school, and then she had a meltdown this morning because she doesn't want to leave Toledo, and she didn't want to leave the house, and so we did. So Marilyn says, "Well, you can come with us to Bible study." I'm thinking, but I have this passage in my. I was like, how am I going to get around this? So I'm glad Marilyn had to take her out. Esther pleased the king greatly in the bedroom, more than the other girls. She was not singing a song. She would then be it says in the passage, she would be taken to the harem after the nights with the king. You were only taken to the harem if you had sex with the king, because you would then never be allowed to get married. Because she had sex with the king, right? She becomes more valuable as a dowry, right? She was the mistress of the king. Kings wouldn't allow anybody else to have any woman he had been with. In terms of how long it took for this whole process to go, one commentator suggests that there were 1,400 women who went through the king's bedchamber. She won! Again, not by singing a song. She was allowed to take anything in with her that she wanted. And she pleased him more than any other person. Now, I don't know exactly what happened. I'm glad I don't. Right? If you're making a movie of the Bible, you leave this part out, right? But how do you please a pagan king to get him to choose you over 1,400 women as his wife? I don't think it takes much imagination. She tried hard to win. Did she want to be queen? She hides her Jewishness, and she does a really good job in the bedchamber. I think the answer to that question is yes, she wanted to be queen. Whether she had even though you're right, she didn't have a choice of whether she was there. I think you're exactly right, Renee. I think the evidence is she wanted to have that. She wanted this. The evidence is she tries hard to get it. And if the idea is, look, God wanted to put her there, well, God could have put her there while her being very Daniel-like and saying, no, I'm going to proclaim who I am, and I'm going to pray, and somehow God still works that out. Yes, God could have done it that way. She didn't have to hide her Jewishness in order for God to make her queen if the whole idea is for God to make her queen. Note, it never actually says God was trying to make her queen. Ever. Again, nowhere in the book does Esther ever pray. Does Mordecai ever pray? Never do they mention God's name. Moving a little bit ahead in the book. So Esther is now queen. And we read about a problem between Haman and Mordecai. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. That would have made him Grand Vizier, Jafar's role in Aladdin. It's exactly the same role. That's the role in the Persian court that he would have had. He would have been Grand Vizier. And all of the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. And then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, he told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told him he was a Jew. He did not hide his Jewishness. He just told Esther to do so. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, which, by the way, would have included those in Jerusalem, because while they were allowed to return to Jerusalem, it remained Persian territory. They didn't get their independence when they went back. They were just allowed to go back to their hometown, but still owned by Persia. So the entire Jewish people were at risk of being slaughtered as the result of this incident. Why does Mordecai refuse to bow? Now, the way I often hear this is because you're not supposed to worship a human being, and he was a godly Jew who would not worship a human being. But is that what he was being asked to do? See, in our culture, to bow before somebody feels very worshipful, yes? That's not how this is in much of the world. I used to teach at a school which had about 1/3 international students from Asia. And when they would come into class, they would bow to me. They didn't think I was God. They bowed as a sign of respect. And that is exactly what is happening here. I'll explain how we know this. We know that bowing to Haman was not an act of worship. Rather was an act of respect to someone in a superior position. Oh, well, I don't have this down here. I thought I did. Because Haman can't be asking them to worship him, because who's the person who's to be worshipped in Persia? The king. So if Haman's going around saying, "Worship me," what is Haman saying? And he would have been executed for treason. There's no way Haman is trying to get people to worship him. Now, had the king been doing that, yes. And when when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, their real names, when they refused to bow to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, it's because Nebuchadnezzar was seen as divine. But Haman's a court official. He's not the king. He's not viewed as divine. This is an Eastern act of paying homage to somebody. In fact, later, now the word's not used, but later Mordecai is going to be put into fancy clothes, and people are going to pay homage to him, probably bowing to him. This is what was going on here, yes. Because he doesn't know she's Jewish. Yeah, well, we're going to get to that. In addition, if Mordecai had a problem with bowing to anybody, he would have already been in trouble because he would have already been required to bow to the king. Everybody would have been required to bow to the king. Yet, clearly, he hasn't been getting in trouble for not bowing to the king. And if he's not getting in trouble for not bowing to the king, then why would he be in trouble for not bowing to Haman? So what's going on here? Why does Mordecai refuse to bow to Haman? Again, I don't think it's worship. Again, there's no indication that he's religious. We don't know if he is or isn't. Doesn't say that's why. He never gives the reason like we get in the book of Daniel with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the book does tell us something very specific about Mordecai and Haman. It tells us that Mordecai was a descendant of Benjamin, and Haman was a descendant of Agag. Who's Agag? We've studied Agag. Agag was the king of the Amalekites. And that probably doesn't ring a bell to you, most of you. But you may remember this. When King Saul was ordered to destroy a people, and he left a king alive, and Samuel comes to him and says, "You have disobeyed God because you have not killed everybody," that king was Agag. Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites who Saul the Benjaminites defeated. Why is this relevant? The passage makes it relevant by going out of its way to give us the lineage. Family lineage matters in the Bible. That's why the genealogies exist, right? The passages we always skip over, right? We may not think genealogy matters that much. The biblical world thought it mattered a ton. And when we see genealogy, we should be paying attention to it. When we see is the son of so-and-so, it makes a difference. Here's what I believe is going on. The Benjaminite is refusing to bow to the Agagite. My grandpa beat your grandpa. I'm not going to show you respect. I don't really know what other reason it could be given in the passage. Again, unless it's worship, but I think there's reasons to think that it's not an issue of worship. That Haman would not have been asking them to worship him. Just ordinary Eastern respect, bowing of respect. So the only other reason I can imagine is he has a specific beef with this guy, with Haman. And the only thing in the passage that gives us a reason why he would have had a problem with Haman is who Haman is a relative of. Again, that Mordecai is not refusing to bow to a random Persian. Mordecai is refusing to bow to a descendant of Agag. In other words, Mordecai's action is one of pride, not humility. I'm not going to bow to you. Further evidence of this, that there's a blood feud going on where us Benjaminites don't like you Agagites, and that you Agagites don't like us Benjaminites, is the overreaction of Haman, the seeming overreaction